Yay!
Awesome. Okay, we'll just cue it up then. So yeah, we are coaching Agile Journeys. If this happens to be your first time here, I'd love to hear about it in the chat, so post that in the chat. We added on another co-host because we were growing so rapidly. So Kristen's not here today, but you'll see her next time. And we're just a group of volunteers who are passionate about learning and growing. And so we find topics that we're passionate about and we think our audience will be passionate about too. And these are the things that we have queued up here. And we, so once in a while, we have what we call as an Agile cocktail, where we just talk about stuff around a topic. We don't have a speaker and we just kind of gather around and chat. So if you have a topic you'd like us to cover, you can also post it in the chat and get us start thinking about that to schedule that. So I think almost all our co-hosts are here today. So thanks everybody for showing up. Appreciate your time. So we host this with our own fund. So if you love coaching Agile Journeys and you've been here a few times, consider giving us a tip. Just go on our website, coachingagilejourneys.com, click on Buy Us a Coffee. I wish we really used it for that, but it's just to host our website and promote these events. The next talk is going to be about no estimates, but I'm not going to talk about no estimates as much as I'm just going to share with you that we are I'm going to go back to the org design. So excited to introduce to you Chelsea Williams, and when I met her, she's like, I pretty much geek out on org design, and I was sold at that moment. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea.
Great, thank you, Heidi. And I will go ahead and share my screen and make sure that I'm sharing the right one to begin with.
And then just, not to interrupt, but in just a second, I will be posting a link to Slido in the chat for everybody. So as you have questions for Chelsea, you could click on that link that I'm going to post here in the chat in just a second, and you could enter your questions and you could upvote other questions that you like.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, but first vote in her poll about how much you know about org design. It will help her tailor her content probably.
Yeah, so as you come in, just feel free to go to that website and answer that poll. We'll come back to the results in a bit. But I just want to thank the Coaching Agile Journeys group for allowing me to speak with you today. I'm really excited to be here. Like Heidi mentioned, I'm a bit of an org design nerd, but I'm particularly excited to talk to this community of people. I think there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn between Agile transformation and what we see happening in organizational design efforts. So I think some of this will resonate deeply with you, and I'm excited to have an ongoing conversation with how we can start thinking about making our entire organizations more agile and responsive. So by way of introduction, I just thought I would start by sharing a little bit about where I came from. So started out working at Intuit at a very interesting time. When I joined, they were moving from desktop software or desktop kind of CD-ROMs, imagine TurboTax sold in big box retailers, to software as a service. So I was at Intuit when they were transforming from waterfall to agile development. It was really interesting. I'm not an engineer, but got to see that transformation take place. And then, as one does in San Francisco, I got bit by the startup bug. So I joined a 5-person startup called Virtually Live, which is a virtual reality sports platform. And we grew to around 50 people. And it was really these two experiences that made me more interested in the human side of change management and behavior. So I decided to enroll in a master's program. I'm currently a master's candidate in Northwestern's Learning and Organizational Change program. And I also consult with Chicagoland companies on how to work better together, how to kind of reimagine the way that they work together toward a shared purpose. And that photo of me on the right is me in my happy place hiking in the Sierra Nevadas. So if any other hikers are out there, I'd love to swap notes after. Okay, so real fast, I did a quick introduction of myself, and I want to know who's on the other side of the screen. So thank you for filling out the poll if you did. Very interesting distribution. Okay, so we've got some experts on the line. I imagine they might be coming from my program as well. Enough to keep me honest, great. So please do, if you have any questions, clarifications, challenges in the chat, I'd love to engage with those, and I'll leave time throughout to ask for Q&A. And for the rest of you, I hope that this serves as an opportunity to learn something new and share it with people that you work with. That's my hope. So what we're going to do today, we're going to touch briefly on kind of what is organizational design, why should we care about it, what's happened in the past, and how does that inform what we see happening going forward, specifically around the principles underlying the trends that are taking place right now. And then we'll close out by, I'll leave you with a few tips on how to create sticky change. So we all know that these principles and these theories and ideas are interesting, but if you can't actually implement them effectively within your teams and your organizations, there's no use. And that is actually the hardest part. So we'll wrap up with that. So why are we even talking about organizational design? Why did you take time out of your day to come listen to this presentation? I think we all feel a need. We all are probably familiar with this statistic, and it's quite scary to think that 87% of the global workforce is disengaged at work, and our productivity is really suffering from it. But not only company productivity, but there was actually a book published recently called Dying for a Paycheck that talks about the human health impact that this is having on us as well. So it's a problem for everybody. I think we should all care that this is happening. Some people are calling it, a bit of an epidemic, and organizational design and being more thoughtful about how we structure our companies and our rewards and incentive systems is one leverage point to try and kind of flip this chart on its head. So clearly work isn't working today. But what's gotten us here? Well, a lot of times we think about org design, we think about org chart. I know this is a simplified version of this, but I find this fascinating. So this is an organizational chart from 1855 of the Erie Railroad system. Okay, looks kind of like our org charts today. This is an org chart from 1917 of a company now known as IBM. We're all familiar with them. 1987, this is a P&G org chart when they introduced the global matrix system to organizational structures. And then this is today, insert your company name. Likely this is similar to what you see in your intranet of how your company is structured. So I think the kind of eerie thing here is that these all look somewhat similar. Not a lot of change has happened. And I'm not trying to simplify in this saying that you just need to replace squares with circles and straight lines with curvy lines. But there's an argument that maybe we need to turn a more discerning eye to the way that we structure our companies today. So a quote that I will share, and I usually don't read from a slide, but to me it's very powerful, is intuitively we know that design should serve a functional purpose and deliver on a strategy. Then why, when we design organizations, do we copy and paste the same boxes and the same roles? It's time for an era of conscious organizational design. Bud Caldwell is a founder of a organizational transformation firm, a good company to look into if you're interested in this space. So that's kind of the way of the past, and I didn't spend much time on it, but I think what's more interesting, and hopefully what people are here to learn about, is what trends we see coming our way. And everybody loves a good word cloud. So I thought this was pretty indicative of what we see happening right now. And that is often inherent in paradigm shifts. We have a lot of terms and names that are being used to describe somewhat similar things that are happening. We're humans, we like certainty, and we like to be able to share our thoughts. So we kind of codify it by naming it something. So it's kind of distributed right now. People are probably familiar with Holacracy. It's this framework used for self-managing organizations that Zappos uses. Spotify squads is a popular one when you talk about decentralized kind of teams of teams, et cetera. So all of these are happening and taking place, which I think is great. But what I also try and talk to my clients about sometimes is, let's not focus on the language. Let's talk about the underlying principles that your team and that are appropriate for your team and your organization. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to spend time on some principles. And this isn't all-inclusive. I'm going to definitely not be able to touch on them all, but I wanted to pick 5 that I thought were useful for this audience and also applicable. So when I talked to the hosts of this webinar, I said, those who join these webinars love to be able to take things back and try them on tomorrow with their teams and organizations. So that's what I'm going to be hoping to do today. So getting the elephant out of the room, what we won't spend time on, like I mentioned, specific frameworks. If you want to know how to implement Holacracy, talk to me afterwards, but we won't spend time on that today. And then a big one is purpose. Purpose is probably the most fundamental principle behind any organizational design strategy. But again, it's its own webinar, and it's probably less malleable, and it's harder to kind of make impact on tomorrow. So the 5 principles, what are they? So we've got distributed authority, role-based, transparency, flexible work, and emergence. And so for all of these principles, which I'll go through for the majority of this time, I'll talk about kind of what they mean in contrast to where we are maybe right now and where we've been. I will offer up 1 or 2 activities or experiments that you and your team can try out hopefully tomorrow. So I'm calling that Try It On. And then third, I will provide examples of bright spots. So these are positive deviants. These are organizations that are doing this really well. It's not a best practice yet, but they're kind of the ones that are standing out within these specific principles. And if you want to learn more, they're really good companies that we can start to emulate. So my one kind of thing I want to mention before we jump into the principles is really this concept of try it on, and I think the Agile community really gets it. It's the idea that no organizations are the same, like a snowflake, as some like to say. So really, when I offer up these ideas, don't be afraid to kind of try it on your team tomorrow, but then alter it, add it, remove to it. Do whatever you need to do to make it right for you. And if it doesn't work, get rid of it. And maybe there's only one of these principles that you really think you can enact change in. Focus on that one for the next week and see what happens. It's kind of incremental bite size. Okay, so the first one is distributed authority. So we've probably all heard about the trends towards flatter structures, right? Organizations all want to be less hierarchical right now. And it's very popular and it's good. But what exactly does that mean? You can remove you can flatten a structure by removing titles or by just removing kind of the middle management layer. But if you don't change the decision-making rights or authorities in the organization, nothing will change. So likely that decision-making power will still reside in the hands of very few who are higher up and most likely further away from your customer or your end user. So we need to be more specific when we say flatten structure and talk really about who has the authority to make decisions. So decision-making authority, like I mentioned, is all about moving those rights down towards information. So people that are closest to the source of the information should be making those decisions within boundaries and constraints, obviously. Secondly, it's important to give individuals explicit permission that they can do what is needed to accomplish their objective or their mission towards a greater purpose within their specific domain. So that explicit permission from leadership or from the mutual group or the total group is really important. And another great thing about distributed authority is that it really leverages the collective intelligence. So you get more people making decisions that are more appropriately placed to make those decisions instead of just a select few that have maybe been in the organization longer or have a higher title. So let's get into the fun part. Let's try it on. This one's a get your feet wet activity because it's pretty low commitment, but it's very impactful. And it might have been shared on a webinar with this group earlier, but I think it's a really powerful one. It's called Delegation Poker. It's provided by Management 3.0, so you can go to their website, download these cards, and print them out for free. But essentially what it does is it gets teams to start talking about maybe the unspoken decision-making rules that exist on a team today. So for example, if you have a project coming up and it's kind of clear maybe who is the manager on your team and who would make the decision, play this game, give everyone a card, ask them who has decision-making authority to decide which backend infrastructure we use. And everyone gets to put their card up. And if you have 2 people that are saying, I am a tell, so I get to decide, kind of no holds bar, then that is obviously a conflict and it kind of inspires this conversation to be had, which normally doesn't happen on teams. Teams don't normally do this naturally. So this is kind of a fun, lightweight way of getting that conversation going. And you can do it just with each other. You don't need a proper facilitator or anything. You can just print these cards off from the website. So like I said, this doesn't necessarily make the change quite yet, but it gets people to start talking openly about where the authority currently stands. So another try it on activity that's a little bit, not risky, it's not the right word, a bit more than just getting your feet wet. So this is actually changing behavior on your team. It's called the advice process. And the way it works is that someone notices a problem or opportunity within their specific domain. Let's call them the decision maker. The decision maker thinks about how they might solve this issue and starts to formulate a plan. We'll call that the proposal. Then the decision maker may seek input from the colleagues who might be affected by this or who have the most expertise. And the key word is they seek the input from, they're not asking for permission. They take this advice into account, they revise their proposal, and then they decide how to move forward. So they also inform those who have been asked for advice, and then possibly more broadly, and they move forward. So this is a really different change from top-down, kind of command and control hierarchy and telling people how something should be done, but it's also avoiding stalemate through consensus, which is very common when people think about let's involve everybody in our decision making. And so this is a good solution to that. You're not necessarily giving everyone the right to say yes or no, but you're asking them for their input. And if you really want to learn about, this is kind of a lightweight explanation of it. If you want to actually try this out on your team, Google the phrase reinventing organizations decision making, and you can get a lot more detail on how to start using the advice process on your team. So a bright spot that we want to talk about. So this bright spot is the USS Santa Fe, which was captained by David Marquette. And you might be thinking, this is not a company, this is so different than what I expect. And also, you normally don't think of armed services as being early adopters of these kind of progressive ways of working because of their allegiance to tradition and to order and to hierarchy. But actually, there are really interesting experiments that come out of our military services, including this one here. So the story is that David Marquette was unexpectedly asked to captain the USS Santa Fe, which was essentially the laughing stock of the Navy. It was the worst performing ship in the fleet. And what he did was he really made a commitment to divest control and distribute it down to his crew that were actually closest to the work being done. And the way he did this is he encouraged his crew to use one simple phrase, I intend to. So instead of I would like to or can I, his crew was encouraged to use the phrase I intend to. So it's very similar to the advice process. These people have the authority to do so. They might ask for input, but if it's not doing any harm, then they move forward with the decision that they believe is best. And within that period of time under his control, the ship moved from worst to first in achieving the highest retention and operational standings in the Navy. So hopefully you can draw some parallels to your organization. I know it's a little bit tricky when it's military, but this process also works really, and I've seen it work really well in companies as well. So if you're interested in learning more about how he actually instituted this change and how it felt for the people working for him, then this is a great book called Turn the Ship Around. So principle number 2 is role-based. This is probably one of my favorites. So we're moving essentially away from the concept of a title to the concept of being role-based. So now if we think back on kind of this idea of conscious organizational design, I bet many people here, myself included, haven't really stopped to think about, why do I hold a title? It's just kind of something I do. It's how I got this job. You know, I applied for this title in this recruiting stack. Like it is the way it is. And titles are not bad per se, but there are definitely some limitations. Yes, they're great because they help outside people understand what you do internally. They also help your internal colleagues understand what you do. They kind of are shorthand for your skill set. They also set you on kind of a path for promotion or career development, given the titles. And so that's actually also where some of the limitations come in. You know, imagine if you've had the title of software engineer for 15 years and suddenly you're really interested in trying out some web design. It's going to be really tricky to convince people that they should give you work in web design when your title says engineer, even if you have done web design underneath your previous titles. So the other issue with titles is that it usually doesn't capture 100% of your responsibilities. So the idea about roles is that a few things. First, they are very specific and custom to the type of work and project that your team is doing. So they're not a generic title that was just borrowed from either legacy or from what your competitor company is hiring for, right? They're designed specifically for the work that's being done. And therefore, they're also fluid, because as projects come and go on teams, the accountabilities and the responsibilities will change slightly as well. So roles can and should shift a little bit to explain what's actually the work that's actually being done. The other thing is the concept of you can cut a role, but you don't need to cut a person. So if a project becomes unfunded or a feature that you're working on gets deprioritized, the role might be cut. You might no longer need this work to be done, but you as a person can then transfer and start working on other projects. And lastly, and this is maybe the psych nerd in me, but it's actually been proven that when people are able to play to their strengths, so they can choose the types of work that they want to do, and they can also choose it across a variety of areas, it activates the reward system in your brain and makes you more engaged. So to get at the chart earlier about 87% engaged, this is one method that you can start to get people more engaged in the work they're doing. So the try it on. So again, this is another activity that you can try out with your team tomorrow. It's pretty safe to try. If it doesn't work, adapt it and do whatever you need to do it. But essentially the way it would work is, okay, so imagine your team has a new project they're working on. You want to be clear about the purpose of this project, but don't come in with too many expectations. So call a team meeting, and what you'll do is, as a collective group, you'll come up with the list of accountabilities that need to make this project successful. And by accountabilities, I mean what work really needs to be done to get this project off the ground. So it'll be everything possibly from, okay, we need to obviously QA our code, but we also need to generate internal support for our project because we need to get funding for it. Also, we should probably talk to some customers and figure out what they like to hear. So those are kind of all the accountabilities, and make an exhaustive as a list as possible, really, really long. And then what you'll do is you start to group the accountabilities that naturally go together. So kind of setting up our QA environment might go with QAing our code. Ensuring our design is useful might go with talking to our customers. And you'll assign them role names. So quality assurance, customer insights, spokesperson. And again, these are tailored to this specific project. And then you'll determine who fills which roles, and reminder that people can hold multiple roles. So it's an interesting experiment to try. I would love to hear if anyone does this on their team, how it goes. You tend to find that people get really jazzed and excited to raise their hand for things that you never would have expected, which is amazing. And yeah, so if you try it out, let me know. This is one of my favorites. Okay, so for bright spots, there's a company called Buurtzorg. It's a 10-year-old healthcare organization in the Netherlands, and it has the highest client satisfaction rate. It's been named the best employer, and EY actually said that if all of our companies in the Dutch healthcare system provided services this way, we would save around 40%. So clearly, whatever they're doing is working well for them. So what is one of the reasons that they are so successful? It has to do with their organizational structure, using this role-based team. So they have 10,000 employees across 850 teams that are pretty self-managed, and each team is made up of 7 roles. Now, for their specific industry, healthcare, the roles tend to be less fluid, more strict. So they have the same 7 roles across all the teams. But there's people hold the main role in which they were hired in to do. So if you're a nurse, generally, you should probably do nursing work when you join the organization. But then based on the rest of their capacity, they're able to choose between the other roles, and the roles can also rotate. So it's really fascinating. Other healthcare organizations are starting to emulate them because it works so well, really high engagement, and most importantly, the patients that they're serving are really pleased with the service as well. So principle number 3, we have transparency. So this is Dwight from The Office, if you're familiar with him. And, you know, he says in the first episode of the show, information is power. And it's kind of a joke, but, you know, he's actually right. So under the conditions of The Office, which is really a satire on the more extreme example of command and control, under these conditions, hoarding information did serve people really well. And they were also incentivized to do so. So it makes sense that this is what we know. And this is kind of what's been done in the past. But now with, you know, the democratization of data and proliferation of information, it no longer serves people to hold on to that knowledge. Not only that, but if we believe in the first 2 principles, we believe in letting people make decisions closer to the information, then we need to equip everybody with all of the information they could possibly need and let them discern what is most important to them. So I know this isn't groundbreaking for anybody, right? I think we all kind of can get behind this one. It's very challenging because of a few reasons, but ego being one of them, quite honestly. So there's a lot of behavior change that's actually wrapped up in this one specifically. And so as an organizational designer, I'm always thinking about how do you design systems that incentivize or nudge people to be more transparent. So we'll talk about that with some of our activities. So getting your feet wet. This is a good experiment for everybody. Basically, the concept is around defaulting to open. So think about your internal communication platform that you use at your company. I use Slack here as an example because many people do use Slack, but it could be whatever. For a week, just 1 week only, with your team or even your broader organization, try having no private Slack channels. So don't even allow people to one-on-one chat. Just see what happens. And you'll observe the behaviors in a week, and if it doesn't work again, it's fine, go back to creating private channels. But it might be interesting to see which streams of conversation start to become more popular, who becomes involved in different conversations that you wouldn't have expected before. Because really here it's the idea that there's no central body or individual figures that should control or constrain the information flow. Let people decide which information they find is most valuable to do their work. And then it also obviously allows for a lot more cross-pollination of information. So another kind of example that's maybe a bit more advanced is to hold open meetings. And now I don't just mean internally. I think that is amazing. If you are on a product team, open up your meetings to anyone in the company that wants to join. But I also challenge you to think about maybe opening up your meetings to the external population. So there's a company called Percolab that they have standing Tuesday meetings, and they invite anyone to come take a seat. So they leave a couple open chairs. And they found that sometimes these are customers that come in the door that have feedback to give them on their product, or maybe it's just someone interested in exploring the ways that they work, and they really encourage engagement from the external perspective. And I find this fascinating. So maybe try that on if you're open to it. So the bright spot here is a company called Buffer. And what they do is they post all of their salaries on their internal intranet. So anybody that works at Buffer can see what they're being paid as well as what anybody else is being paid. And they use this salary formula, and they're very open about how they come up with salaries. So I think there's a lot of beauty in this type of transparency. For starters, it helps, mitigate gender pay gap, for example. So there's a lot of beauty that can come out. It's definitely harder for people to wrap their heads around, thinking about how do you sometimes quantify maybe some experience that doesn't necessarily fall within this formula, but they write a lot on their blog about how they've made this transition and this journey and how it's been for them. So if you're interested in learning about this company, check out their blog. So just do a quick time check. Okay. So principle number 4 is around flexible work. Again, not necessarily a novel new concept to everyone. I think we're all reading the reports and seeing that this is definitely a trend and wave of the future. It's a very hot topic at the moment. So today, and there are a lot of stats, so this might not be the most up to date, but about 43% of Americans spend time working remotely. I know I do, and I think many people on this call can definitely relate. And by 2020, 75% of Americans will spend time working remotely. I think it might even be higher. So what's, I think, really interesting about this is there are huge implications for the way that teams communicate with each other, for the way that teams develop trust, for the way that they collaborate and make decisions. You know, every norm on a team gets a bit disrupted when you move to a non-co-located model. And teams are really, really bad at making this transition at the moment. There's a lot of reports talking about the kind of cost to the company of that transition period, right? There's also definite benefits when you get over that hump, but that transition is really tricky for teams that have been co-located for so long, or start to invite in remote employees to their team. And there could be an entire webinar on this topic alone. But what I wanted to share that I think is a really helpful tool that I've used with some clients is this idea of local rules. And huge shout out to August. So they're an organizational design consulting firm who posts all of their tools and resources on a public Google Drive to talk about full transparency. I mean, this is what they pay, clients pay them for, and yet they post it open for anybody to use. So really amazing. Essentially, it's a tool that you introduce to teams to help them, whether they're dispersed or not. There's a lot of value in this for co-located teams, to get them to start making agreements and to precisely define and agree on by all how they're going to operate together. So if you haven't already done something like this, there's team charters and user manuals. I highly encourage it on your teams to get very, very specific about the agreements that you're making on your local team. Make it just for your immediate colleagues. So bright spot example, I'm going to do two here because I think they're interesting. So Zapier, might be pronouncing it wrong, Zapier, is a 100% remote team. So they have about 125 employees across 13 countries. They build a software integration tool with, I think, close to 1 million people using their product. So very successful. And they've done a really good job of making remote work. And they also publish something called the Ultimate Guide to Remote Work. So they get into the very actionable details of how to hold meetings on a remote team, how to deal with kind of time zone constraints on remote teams. So if your team is trending in this direction, or you already are on a remote team and you want to learn more best practices, this is a great guide. The other one is GitLab. It's an open source Git repository manager. So they have over 320 employees, also completely remote, and they likewise do a really good job sharing with others what best practices they've learned through their transformation and their journey. So they have something called the Remote Manifesto if you're interested in learning more about that. So the final principle, saving for last, is emergence. And how many of you have worked for a company that has done a 3-year plan? I mean, I definitely have. Even on a startup, we did a 1-2 year lookout. And most companies measure their performance in this way. They think about, how are we going to allocate our resources over the next 3 years? How are we going to even communicate to the public that we're hitting these goals we've set for ourselves and therefore performing well? And yet all of this planning is predicated on certainty. And we know that we live in a very uncertain, changing environment these days. So, if we thought that today at year zero, that big box retailers are going to be our most profitable sales channel. So we're going to forecast out 3 years, banking on that sales channel as being our richest. And then we're going to hit our targets, and our shareholders are going to be happy with us, and all of this is going to be good. Well, enter Amazon, and we all know how that happens. Right? So there's this idea that, I'm not saying throw a baby out the bathwater or don't do any planning, but start to flex the muscle of emergence and becoming more comfortable with designing and solving for uncertainty. So a great quote is, Alice says, "There's no use trying one can't believe impossible things." The Queen says, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was younger, I always did it for a half hour each day. why sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. So don't be the Queen of Hearts. One way to start flexing this muscle, you can't go kicking and screaming into your management team tomorrow and say, no more planning. Your finance team would probably not be happy with that. But one thing you can do in your local team is the idea of an emergent agenda. And this one's just fun and interesting and also very safe to try. Essentially what you do is choose an existing team meeting that you have with your team and don't set an agenda beforehand. Generally set the topic of what will be discussed, but don't set an agenda. Once you open up the meeting, have everyone popcorn the items that they would like to discuss in that meeting pertaining to that topic. And then go through and process each agenda item in the order that it was received. So it seems pretty simple. You might find that there are things top of mind on your employees' top of mind that was not on your radar. So this is a great way to kind of co-create agendas and source the information, source kind of the maybe issues that really need to be discussed. Another way to kind of move just authority down towards the people and let them partake in the formation of the agenda. So bright spot example of this is Handelsbanken. I hope I pronounced that right. So they're a Swedish bank with 550 branches worldwide. And in 1970, so they were ahead of their curve, they abandoned traditional budgeting process. So yes, a bank decided that, nope, we're not going to do any budgeting. And they're actually one of the world's most cost-efficient banks. So what they do instead is they have small profit centers, and they say each profit center is in charge of deciding which products they want to sell. But besides that, everything is managed at the local branch level. And they don't do any kind of org-wide financial planning. And they use a principle or a set of principles called beyond budgeting. So some people on this call might be familiar. If you wanted to learn specifically about how emergence applies to finances and how to break the cycle of constant planning, then check out Beyond Budgeting. Okay, so those are the 5 principles. And maybe it's now I've been talking at you all for so long. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing for a second and see if there's anything very top of mind. Maybe in the Slido that has come up, or?
Yeah, so, all right, we got some great questions coming in through Slido, and the one with the top vote right now is, when command is driven from hierarchical authority figures, how do you influence that decentralizing command and distributing the authority will be a better approach for the organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it relates to, what if I don't have, what if the leadership is not on board with this? How do we actually create change? And I'm not going to say it's easy to do if your leadership is not on board, because these are big structural changes. But one thing that is really powerful is the concept of inspiring up. So if you can practice these things on a local level, if you can practice decentralized decision making and show leadership or show the people who are in the command and control position that it is serving your customers better, it is contributing to your bottom line, whatever metric they care about, then they'll start to notice. If other teams also start to emulate what you're doing, then they'll start to notice. So I think inspiring up is a really powerful way to get the ear and the acknowledgement of upper management.
Excellent. All right, so the next question that we have, which got 3 votes, is, when delegating authority, how do you deal with people who only want to be told what to do, checking their brain at the door for safety reasons?
This goes a little bit to something called Theory X and Theory Y. So Theory X says that exactly that. People are just there to do the work and to be told what to do. They don't have a lot of ownership over the work that they're doing. Theory Y says, no, generally everybody kind of wants to contribute. They want to have ownership over what they're doing, but maybe there are constraints in place that force them to kind of check out. So I know the theory doesn't help by explaining that. But there is this debate even against kind of organizational psychologists of where people are. I'm more in the theory Y camp. I think that likely that person, if incentivized properly, and a lot of times that might be intrinsically motivated, they will start showing up and caring more. So we can do a whole nother session on intrinsic motivation, but there are different levers you can pull around giving them more autonomy, giving them more purpose in what they're doing. So maybe they need to start contributing more to the decision making. Maybe they feel like if they speak up, nothing's going to change, so why even bother? So that's why they're kind of checked out. So I think really trying to get at what is intrinsically motivating to them. And there are interesting tools, and I'm blanking on one of the names right now. Motivation, essentially it's kind of a assessment you can ask people to take that helps you discover what motivates them. Is it that they really like to be recognized publicly, or is it that they like to be given a lot of freedom and kind of left alone? So everybody's motivated differently. But I believe that if you motivate them properly, they're going to start showing up engaged.
Excellent. So another question with 3 votes in pure transparency. Question submitted by Brian K. Haney. Thank you. That's transparent there. That's one of the principles.
Hi, Brian.
Org charts are evolving from a series of static states toward a fluid org model. What helps orgs be more fluid?
Yeah, and what I didn't do today is I didn't show an example of an org chart that is more fluid, right? So I didn't show a holacratic org chart or a teams of teams model. But I think, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, are you asking the behaviors that start to get at more fluidity, or how can you structurally show fluidity in an organizational chart? We can fix, don't know, but sorry, I'm reading the chat as well. Oh, sorry. Okay, so can you repeat the question just so I make sure I'm...
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I can't really interpret Brian's question, but org charts are evolving from a series of static states to a fluid org model. What helps the orgs be more fluid? And maybe I could add some context, because this just came up. I just saw a manager presentation where they went to like a special ops decentralized command that they learned from a general that was studying ISIS, and how ISIS was so effective in communicating and putting out their attacks. And it was one of those, it almost looked like a dot matrix. Like they couldn't even trace the communication, because the communication didn't start with an authority figure or a figurehead. And they're even having trouble pinning who's at the head of this ship. And our United States Special Forces took this on. So as a manager, I said, this is what I want my org to look like. And the slide right after that to show it's easier said than done was, and this is the way our org looks today. And it was that hierarchical, static, it looked like a family tree type thing. Well, if we want to be there, how do we make it more fluid to get there and break this mold of being in this family tree looking thing?
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on a great example. So that's General Stanley McChrystal, I believe, yes. And he wrote a book called Teams of Teams. And one of the practices, among others, that he talks about really helping create this fluidity and breaking down those hierarchies is he created a very regular cadence of meetings that he then opened up to everybody that wanted to be involved. And so there was still decision-making authority probably higher in the ranks. You actually maybe would hope in this situation. But everybody was given the same information. And so that communication could spread like wildfire much more quickly. So we were no longer being left in the dust by, I believe it was the Taliban, who were using social media to communicate their plans. And yet we had to wait till next Tuesday to have a meeting with our commander. It was this practice of opening the meetings up to everybody, holding them very consistently every morning. I think they held a meeting to share this information. So I think there's definitely a lot of ways in which you can start moving organizations to more fluidity, more agility.
Kind of like a stand-up.
Kind of like a stand-up. Thank you, Agile community, for that.
Yeah. And I think what came out of his speech, and it's something very similar to what Heidi is out doing, is giving them a mission and giving them autonomy to accomplish that mission and operate. Like, hey, there are no authority figures. You're all leaders. You know, you do whatever you need to do to accomplish the mission. So it's kind of cool stuff.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Should I wrap up? I only have a few more slides and then we'll answer.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, definitely. If we have time at the end, we can come back. Slido's there and people can keep voting or submit some more questions.
Thanks, awesome. So far.
So just real quick, because I promised it, I do want to talk about, and it's, doing an entire kind of master's on one of these concepts, which is change management. How can you actually create change that is sticky? This is the hardest part in any organizational change. And here, if anyone has studied change management, this is called the Valley of Despair. Anytime you're going through even individual change, you kind of have to make your way through Valley of Despair as you are unlearning old behaviors and relearning and learning new ones. So really the idea and the charge for change leaders, organizational designers, whatever it may be, is to shorten the time that people spend in the Valley of Despair. So make it more shallow and less lengthy. And here are some maybe 3 tips to consider when making a change. The first one being show people what it might look like in that future state, make it safe, and make it easy. So by showing the future state, this is a great story. So this is Roger Bannister, who was the first person to beat the 4-minute mile in 1954. It was very unexpected. He wasn't even going to run that day. It's kind of its own case study in performance. But what I find so unique about this story is, so he was the first person on at least the main stage to break the 4-minute mile. And yet and yet I believe it was 56 days later, a man named John Laddie, an Australian runner, broke the barrier again. And over the last half century, more than 1,000 runners have conquered this barrier. So really the point being, showing people what that future state looks like helps them start to imagine it. And it becomes, removing the impossible to the possible. The second one is, sorry for getting a little nerdy on y'all, but it's this concept that people only really change or learn new behaviors. Survival anxiety is greater than learning anxiety. So imagine if your job is going to be automated tomorrow, or if your company is going to be disrupted tomorrow, then you're probably going to make change happen because your survival anxiety is very, very high. But we don't want people to be in a perpetual state of, anxiousness over their own well-being. So another way is to actually decrease learning anxiety. So this is when a lot of people talk about creating psychological safety on teams, normalizing learning from failure, sharing your failure stories more often, and kind of being vulnerable with taking those risks. And really acknowledging that there is some pain that comes with unlearning new behaviors, but how can we make it safer for people? And the last one is change the banana. So I'm going to tell a little story working on my storytelling. Imagine it's Monday morning, you're walking into your office, you've skipped breakfast because, your kid couldn't find his left shoe, so he was late to the bus, and your stomach is grumbling, and you're really excited though because Mondays are fruit delivery days, right? We all have been in those companies where on Monday there's a big basket of fruit in the kitchen. So you turn the corner of the kitchen, you're really excited for this banana, and this is what you see. You're pissed. And of course, you walk away. You don't grab an orange. You go back to your desk, kind of cursing under your breath. You don't grab an orange, though, despite the same level of hunger. And people actually studied this phenomena. And what they found was that objectively, there's no difference in the deliciousness. So people didn't actually think the bananas were more delicious. It solely came down, their popularity came down to one thing, which was their ease of peeling. So it was just easier for people to eat a banana than it was an orange. And that's the only reason that they chose bananas. When we think about making change in our organizations, make it easy for people to try, make it safe, less risky, all these things. A good example is if you want to promote transparency and communication, set the default to require people to opt into it being private, right? So change default mechanisms so that it's easier for people to choose the behavior change that you want them to make. So that's it for me. Here are some books and podcasts that I'm inspired by. And I can send this out. I think we can post it out later if you can't copy it all down now. Reinventing Organizations is, hands down. If any of this resonated with you, I really encourage you to read that book. It was a bit of a life-changing book for me. And lastly, I'd love to connect. I'd love to hear how maybe your teams are trying out some of these activities, or just your thoughts around this topic. So any of these mediums work.
Yeah, we can post the content on our website when we post the video.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And thank you again to everyone for listening in and taking an hour out of your day. This was a real pleasure.
Yeah. Jeff, are there any more questions in Slido?
Yeah, there's definitely some more questions. So we'll wrap the day up with some questions.
Perfect.
Some more transparency. Caroline, she submitted a question. So hopefully Caroline's still here. Thanks for such a great webinar, she said. So I agree completely.
Thank you.
What are the new skills or mindsets needed for people to function well in these new structures?
Oh, that's interesting. And there's actually, I'll shout out to a woman named Lisa Gill, who is doing work specifically on this. She uses the term human skills instead of soft skills. We all think about, those soft skills that maybe are less important than the hard skills, but she calls them human skills. And it's really the idea that we all have these, we all actually have these skills innately in us, but they've kind of been covered up through the command and control and the other maybe blemishes of organizations in the past. And it's really kind of digging out and unearthing these human skills that we all have. So I think one is not to use the same term, but self-management. So the ability to be to be self-aware, I think, and to have empathy and to be able to communicate kind of what's going on here, as well as your interactions with people. I think being able to have crucial conversations is really, really important for this work, because you can no longer hide behind kind of the layers of management. You're going to be confronted with a lot more, I think, more raw conversations. I see that happening. So I would say being able to have crucial conversations, and the training that goes around with that is really powerful. Yeah, I'm blanking on a couple, but I think those are good places to start.
Awesome. All right, we'll go on to another question. And Brian submitted us another question. How do you reconcile org design, an engineering paradigm, and evolutionary Teal, an organic paradigm?
Would this person be willing to come on and embellish? Come on the chat?
Brian, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, gotcha. It's Brian. Sorry, I didn't hear it was Brian. Hi.
So I see a dichotomy between our traditional notion of organizational design, in quotes, as it's something that we go to a large sheet of paper and we sketch out an org chart, basically. So I see that as being an engineering paradigm, versus what Lalo talks about in his book is that we aspire to evolutionary Teal, which is it's evolutionary. It's an organic paradigm, and we're trying to create organizations that grow by themselves, or not grow, but modify themselves. I think of it as evolution by design, but it's not, definitely not an engineered solution. So what I see there is a contradiction in language that kind of brings that forth, and I wonder if you see that contradiction.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I'm totally in agreement with you. It's why we didn't talk about reorganizations today, right? This idea that we're just going to have a reorg to be in this new agile way kind of doesn't make sense in if you have this more organic, evolving philosophy. And I think if you read Reinventing Organizations and you believe in that, it makes a lot of sense. I think I use the term organizational design, and I still use terms that people can relate to as they're making that change, because they need to be grounded in something that they're familiar with. It's not necessarily to say that I would go into organizations and redraw what their organizational chart looks like. It's just, I think right now it's a helpful bridge for people in using that language of organizational design. There are new tools and softwares like Frog, I think, is one that you can actually take a holacratic, framework and put it in a chart of some sort, so you can actually see where accountabilities and roles lie, which I think helps with some fluidity because they are more malleable. But at the same time, it then again doesn't speak to more of the Teal principles that we've talked about or that you're bringing up. So I think it's a great question. It's a great point. So thank you for making it.
Have you been able to bridge people into kind of a emergence mindset to start from where they are and then incrementally adapt? Have you had luck with that kind of approach?
Yeah. So do you mean, if I'm hearing you right, like let them trying out small things before they move into bigger reorganizations? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that was kind of what I was hoping to get across with the try it on experiment. Like it's these little tiny behavior change that will start to make bigger adjustments in how your team works together. And that's what I think organizational design is. It's how people work together towards a shared purpose. And it is about just introducing tiny micro experiments to these organizations. And then they go, ooh, that felt good. Like that unlocked something in me that really made sense. Let's take it to the next level, or let's try something else on.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
You're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry about that. Go one more and then we'll close it out for everyone. Do you see people actually moving right now to roles from titles? The one place that I had worked in hated the no titles thing. Yeah,
again, a lot of ego wrapped up in that topic. I absolutely see progressive organizations making that change, and a lot of time it's led by example through leadership. That is definitely a trickier one to enact in a organization that has been around for a while and likes their titles. But I have seen it work in progressive, in kind of the more progressive organizations. And I'm happy to share those organizations, and maybe they've written specifically about that transformation if they did start out title-based. A lot of times these organizations also start out role-based, so it's easier. I think that change is very tricky.
Yeah, I know we just have a couple of minutes left, but I worked in a place that it was a startup actually, and they called it a flat organization. The engineers weren't happy because everybody had the same title, like you work in the design function or I forget what they named it, but that didn't take into account their experience. So now we're talking about engineers who really wanted to be recognized for their achievements. So even though they didn't start out like that, they actually had to implement that kind of system in that org. And it was a startup, but I guess to your point, maybe they just weren't forward thinking, didn't have their leadership in place.
That sounds exactly like what Google did in 2002.
Really?
Yes.
Brian, I'd love to hear more about that.
I've tried to collect more details. We have a VP of culture at Google that was there, and she said that I need to talk to one of our senior VPs, and I haven't got the courage to ask him about those details yet. So, but that Google did do, but long before their IPO, they apparently did do a flat organizational experiment, and the engineers were the first one to complain.
I heard psychological safety mentioned earlier, and I say don't overlook Project Aristotle results. They're fascinating.
Thank you for that. So if you do a Google search for Project Aristotle at Google, it'll take you to rework.withgoogle.com, and there's a whole lot of information there, and that's one of the key themes that we use in the Team Dev Consulting Group at Google.
Great resource. Thank you for sharing. And thank you for mentioning Project Aristotle.
Cool. Well, do you want to close us out, Heidi? And thank you so much, Chelsea. This was just amazing content.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure. And please reach out and connect.
Yeah.
Afterwards.
Don't forget to join our next session if you're free on August 15th at 12 o'clock noon with Ryan Ripley, who's going to talk about no estimate. So please go to coachingagilejourneys.com and check out our upcoming sessions.
I can't thank the Coaching Agile Journeys team enough. The support team here, you guys are rocking it for us all.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
That we're making
Happy to do it.
Yeah.
Thank
Chelsea,
you.
that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.